So, Logan, let me just ask you. I think this would be a great way to start off the conversation. How do you feel about patients being on Suboxone, Methadone, Naltrexone? Because there's really two camps, right? In the world of medicine, the culture of medicine teaches us that Suboxone, medication for addiction treatment is the way to go. It's the only way to go sometimes. But at the same time, there's people that criticize these policies. And I never really fully understood what was the reasoning behind their kind of hesitancy to support medication for addiction treatment until I did some research for this episode of the podcast. So yeah, I think that would be a great place to start off. How do you feel about just Suboxone, Methadone, and these medications for substance use disorders in general?
Right. I mean, I think it's of course mixed emotions. The world we live in is not purely black and white, and I get the argument that, because these medications, and we can get into the pharmacology, the nitty gritty, but like in many ways it is sort of replacing one opiate for a different version of an opiate, one that I would argue is a much safer opiate. And I understand the critics saying, oh well, isn't that just like still feeding into the addiction? I think that's a very superficial way of understanding things, because there are true physiology changes when your body becomes so exposed to opiates over time that you can literally have changes with the endogenous opioid production in your body. What I mean by that is opioids that are naturally produced in your own body. You can literally become more sensitive to pain, and the numbers don't lie. People who are on these Suboxone, Methadone, these other medication-assisted treatment. I don't know if that's the right semantics. I don't even care.
Yeah.
But it leads to less people overdosing. And I feel very passionate about this because, my friend, Chuck Derwin, I knew this guy from high school. If any one of my friends could ever have made it as a stand-up comedian, I would have put money on this guy. I lost touch with him after high school, and I never saw him alive, and I went to his funeral years after high school. I don't know exactly the details of his death, but look, I don't know. I can maybe read between the lines and think that it could have been an overdose. It's scary. It's extremely sad. And that's why it makes me really think and ponder, I wonder if that person could have been exposed to this sort of therapy if they could have been more successful.
Right. So the first step is the patient, whoever's dealing with an opioid use disorder has to want to have the desire to get on one of these substances, whether it be Suboxone, Naltrexone, or Methadone. And you hit the nail on the head. One of the biggest criticism against medication-assisted therapy is that you're essentially replacing one drug for another, right? You're still dependent on something. And one of the things that I also found was, just piggybacking off of that, there's a bigger moral criticism that certain individuals seem to have, that essentially we are giving up on the process of recovery for certain individuals, right? Because in the viewpoints of the critics, recovery is being completely free of substance use, whether it be naltrexone, Suboxone, or the actual like heroin or whatever it may be. Right. And the philosophy behind it, it kind of, it's like when you have an individual suffering from an opioid use disorder, this individual is somebody who's been habituated in a sense to turn to this drug whenever there's a stressor in their life, whenever there's a moment to celebrate. So essentially for all life events, they're turning to this drug. And are we, for these people, these critics, true recovery means that we're getting this individual to a point where no matter what the trigger is, they don't have the desire to use any kind of substance. So for them, it's, there seems to be a moral complication or moral discrepancy in the fact that we are still providing essentially an opioid. And while I don't necessarily 100% agree with that point of view, I can kind of understand where they're coming from, because I never knew this, but methadone, actually, did you know that when you're taking methadone in certain states that you can be arrested for driving under the influence? because it still has sedative properties. It's still a
Right. And
medication
that's what,
used for pain relief.
right.
You can be drowsy. It can affect your peripheral vision. It can have cognitive slowing. So it's not a totally benign substance. And you can also get high from methadone, right? So
Right. And yeah, like I mean, I think I always talk about kind of it's a dose and potential frequency issue. I've even had patients in the hospital that have either been on methadone and Suboxone. It's like, why the hell is this 65-year-old person on max dose Suboxone? Like, this is crazy. Like, that's way too much. So I think like these are drugs, literally drugs, that absolutely can still be misused the same way as their illicit counterparts can. And real quick, June, and I'd like to let you go on. You mentioned kind of the word recovery, and we kind of started the beginning of this episode talking about semantics, words. And I don't think it's necessarily fair that everyone has the same definition of what recovery means. Some people's definition of recovery maybe is complete abstinence. And I think I would maybe use the word sober there too, right? But maybe some people define recovery as being able to become a functional human being again and engage in work and relationships and activities that make them happy. And what always made me kind of laugh, talking about this medication assisted treatment. I worked at an addiction center for quite some time, and I would argue that is caffeine, sugar, and cigarettes also medication assisted treatment?
in what sense?
I would see oftentimes individuals who, when they would give up on the substance that they perhaps originally enjoyed but turned into be problematic in their life, whether that would be alcohol, opiates, maybe cocaine. There is a true culture of, most especially AA, because I'm most familiar with, but have you ever drove by an AA meeting before or after it starts?
I have not.
Well, there's a great deal of coffee and cigarettes,
Interesting.
and a lot of these individuals, they've been very upfront with me, and they've talked about how they engage in, at times, maybe like a sugar kind of addiction pathology. But I'm almost okay with that in some regard, because I would say, well, it's almost less harmful than what you were originally doing. So in my ways, I would define that as a medication-assisted treatment.
I see what you're saying, Logan. And that reminds me of, are you familiar with the YouTube channel Soft White Underbelly?
It sounds like my body, but no, yeah.
So it's a huge channel, actually. And this guy basically goes out to Skid Row, does interviews with some of the homeless population, and also individuals suffering from a lot of substance use disorders. And one of the things that he said that really stuck out to me is that, so this guy, he goes to the gym at 5 a.m. every single day, right? And he said a lot of the other people that he sees there, they're former addicts.
Right.
And they've replaced that addiction with a healthy behavior. So I can kind of see that similar ethos in what you said with the coffee and the cigarettes, and going to the gym. Of course, arguably going to the gym is much healthier, but in essence, in both of these methods, you're channeling that addictive potential, that desire to want to engage in a certain behavior, and you're subverting it into another type of behavior.
Right.
So I see what you're saying there, Logan, and that's basically the one of the biggest arguments, and I think it's a pretty legitimate argument for the use of Suboxone, Methadone, naltrexone, because, hey, I understand that you are still replacing one opiate with another, but at the same time, this other substance is giving the ability for somebody who's literally lost all control of their lives to live somewhat of a normal life again. They can now return to work. They can now engage in the community. They can now start to work on building their relationships back up again. So, in a sense, I guess it's similar to the coffee and the cigarettes. You're kind of choosing between the lesser of the two evils, right? Would you rather be taking heroin every day, or would you rather be taking Suboxone? I would argue 100% of the time you'd rather be taking Suboxone or Methadone, because at the very least, you can start to live somewhat of a normal life. You can start to regain some of that control that you've lost. So I think that's the strongest argument for the use of MAT, medication-assisted treatment.
Right. And I think what's part of this discussion, and I don't want to, if we're jumping ahead here, pause me, but like, I think what's always another really interesting philosophical question. It's like, okay, well, do I need to be on Suboxone or Methadone for the rest of my life? Is this a 2-year maybe, or 1-year sort of treatment plan, and then I get weaned off? Like, I think that there's very different interesting schools of thought. But I also think part of this has to be kind of patient led too. And well, it's like, well, what are your goals? How are things going? We don't need to make necessarily a decision about the rest of your life now, but we can take this in steps and periods, day by day.
So on the thought of whether somebody should be on methadone or Suboxone for, I don't know, like a week, a month, a year,
Hmm.
or indefinitely. So interesting thing. And I also just realized this while I was doing research for this episode. I never knew this before. Methadone, when it first became FDA approved for opioid use disorder, this was in the early 2000s. Actually, the indication was for it to be used on just a short-term basis.
Hmm.
And the reasoning behind that was like we talked about, this is a medication that's going to help somebody regain a little bit of control that they have. So it was supposed to be combined with therapy and all these other treatment modalities. And the methadone was just supposed to be there initially to kind of help bridge that gap in the beginning stages of, to avoid withdrawal until they can get some therapy under their belt, develop coping mechanisms, and eventually they were supposed to be weaned off of methadone and continue with the therapy and eventually go into total abstinence, right?
Hmm.
That was the philosophy when it was first launched. However, it didn't quite work out like that. The current recommendation is that some patients may need to be on it indefinitely, because once you do get off of it, you do have a very high risk of relapse.
Hmm.
So again, I understand where the critics are coming from that point, because the narrative has shifted in the past 2 decades, right? It was
Right.
initially supposed to be short term, but now they're saying, now that it's widely used, now the mantra is no, this is something that people should be on indefinitely.
Right.
And the philosophical question there is, are we giving up on that individual, and are we confining this individual to live a life of dependency towards methadone or Suboxone for the rest of their lives? Because
Right.
like we talked about, it is sedating, it does have cognitive effects, but at the
Right.
same time, there's so many other positive benefits. So
Hmm.
I personally tend to fall on the side of, if you're motivated for treatment and you don't feel the confidence to go totally abstinent, I think methadone or Suboxone is a great option.
Hmm.
But there are definitely concerns.